The story sounds familiar. Famous footballer, young woman, DMs, Instagram. However, this isn't your typical tryst. According to reports in France and Italy, Mario Balotelli has been accused of rape by a minor. The reports state that it all started back in July of 2017. The young woman, who claims to have been 16 at the time, told police that after exchanging messages with Balotelli, the two met on several occasions. Balotelli confirms this. This culminated with the two going to a nightclub named Choco following Nice's Champions League game against Ajax. This is where the young woman and Mario Balotelli's version of events start to diverge. She alleges that when she was at the club, Balotelli invited her to a private room, and there he stripped her naked and forced her to have sex. Balotelli confirms the sexual encounter, but alleges that she took off her clothes consensually and she seemed uninhibited. He then claims a few weeks later the young woman called him to say that she was 16 and accusing him of sexual violence. The phone call, it would later be revealed by Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera, was recorded. The newspaper claims that in the recording, Balotelli says in the phone call, quote, "The third time I saw it was hurting you, I stopped." It is reported later that the young woman's lawyer told a colleague that she is a, quote, born actress, which he later explained as he meant that she had, quote, controlled her emotions, getting him to talk about that night, end quote. Following this phone call between Balotelli and the young woman's lawyer allegedly called Balotelli seeking 100,000 euros. It is after this phone call that Balotelli went to the police alleging extortion and blackmail. Then, shortly after that, the girl reported the incident to the police herself. So there are two separate investigations going on here: blackmail and sexual assault. As you can hear, the story is quite complex and there is still a lot of unknowns. So we're not going to address the actual incident in this episode. Instead, we're going to focus on how the football media responded and covered the story. Today we ask, what does the Mario Balotelli case tell us about football's relationship with sexual violence? I'm joined by Shireen Ahmed, who is an activist, writer, and co-host of the Burn It Down podcast. Shireen, following the initial reports, what happened to Mario Balotelli?
Well, I mean, immediately, not much. Like, he ended up captaining a match very soon after. So, like, true to form, there's not much. And the position that Nice, the club he plays for, actually takes is, I was looking for some statements, but is very much of, we are looking at this, like we are aware of it, but they'll very much sort of defer to the legal process and whatever that means and what that entails. And in this case, how complicated it actually is.
So it's been a little bit more than a week since this came out in the news. And as we've kind of mentioned, Mario Balotelli is a very controversial, very famous footballer. Is the media just gobbling up this story?
I guess you could say that the media is not. I mean, English-speaking media, I Googled it after I found out, and there was very, very little. Like, there was the traditional Reuters or AP wires that, had said that this is factually, they knew very little. And I don't expect any in-depth reporting on those kind of stories. So it's very brief. English media still, even a week later, has very little. So there are some sites that I follow, football sites, that give a little more detail. But it really comes down to this one particular site that I do follow. It's called Get Football News France. It was just very much reiterating the accuser's side and then what he's saying and VV. So it just becomes salacious detail reporting rather. And in terms of what's been reported, there's been very, very little, in fact. And for the type of global superstar that Balotelli is, I'm quite surprised. There's been so few, mentionings of this at all.
Yes, and of course, the Get Football France news really comes back from this. All starts from a report in Nice Matin, which is a French newspaper. And then, Carrera de la Sport kind of picked it up a little bit. But let's analyze for a moment the few English pieces that we have in the Sun and the Mail, since, of course, neither of us speak Italian. Is there anything that stands out to you about those pieces?
Well, I mean, if you look at the way that they're done, it's just very much, like I said, the salacious gossip and details of this and he said and she said, and very much the narrative is framed that way. There's not a whole lot of conversation about a survivor of alleged abuse. It's not at all. And I'm not looking to the Daily Mail or the Sun to be able to report on things accurately in a way that has any type of understanding or nuance of the situation. So it becomes a sort of gossipy rag story as opposed to insightful reporting.
And does that remind you of any other cases in the past that have dealt with sexual assault?
Well, it's all of them. And to be honest, but in this case, there is a slight difference. I mean, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention there is a history of white women who accuse Black men falsely. And there's a history of that in a racialized context. And I'm not at all saying that typical misogynist, there's, false accusations. That's not what I'm saying when those account for like less than 8%. So I'm not of the reported cases. So I'm not even like, those are two different things that I'm speaking of. But if we ignore the racialized context in here, it would be a problem. Now, the other main, stories about rape in football would notably, obviously, Cristiano Ronaldo, David De Gea, and of whom the charges were dropped against De Gea. Ronaldo is still embroiled in a battle, which his PR machine and lawyers are handling.
Soccer star Cristiano Ronaldo will not play in upcoming international matches after being accused of rape.
Nike has expressed deep concern about a rape allegation against Cristiano Ronaldo, and other consequences are starting to pile up.
Then there's Neymar Jr. So there's a lot. And with Neymar Jr., it was very much the same thing. And the charges against Neymar Jr. were dropped as well because he accused the woman, and she ended up being charged. I haven't followed up with said blackmail or extortion. So it's like what ends up happening is those stories end up being framed as these poor footballers, whereas the actual crux of the story it negatively impacts others that follow and like other survivors that come forward. It's really, really complicated in that way. And to media, if I look to media, like, do I believe that media is getting better? Yeah, in some cases, I do. I think that the way that media reports on these things, traditionally what happens is there's a mention of footballer being implicated and a survivor alleging abuse. And I will preface all of this to say that I believe survivors, like, their lived experience and their traumas lead to things being very vulnerable. So when they're being reported of, it's hard because, I had a journalist once say to me, well, the victim wouldn't talk to me. I'm like, do you realize that the way that you speak to a victim re-traumatizes them? Do you actually understand what happens? And it didn't occur to him at all. It didn't occur to him. It's not black and white. And that's what I'm trying to get down to, is that the way that these stories are written are done without a lot of understanding and expertise and language on how to frame it. And it's very much just very simplistic. Well, he hasn't been proven guilty, and not to forget that guilty in a legal system and like being proven rather not guilty doesn't mean a crime wasn't committed. It just means that it doesn't suit whatever the system's level is of having to prove that person guilty. So it's not the same thing.
I want to go back to something you said before about how the media covers this. And it seemed like you were suggesting, and I've read elsewhere, that there's this idea that there's almost like a predatory female that goes after these types of famous footballers. And, therefore it's kind of on them.
Yeah, I think that victim blaming is probably the go-to approach. I mean, in the discussions about Ronaldo's case, there was so much of an emphasis on, well, she agreed to go with him to his room, or she was wearing this, or she was with him at the club hanging off him. And what people fail to realize in this situation is consent is ongoing. And that's the law, that you can be completely naked with somebody in a space. And I'll be very clear here. But if you say no, that stops. Nobody has a right over your body, period. And I think that people were like, well, her dress was short, so that basically means no. Clothing has nothing to do with rape. I mean, it absolutely doesn't. And this idea that, this is super toxic and misogynistic idea that what someone wears or how someone behaves invites rape is ludicrous. And if you know and understand and read literature or data about survivors by advocates for victims of sexualized violence, you'll know that that's not true. And it frustrates me a lot when I read this kind of stuff. And media, quite often when they report on this, will and I chuckle because it's pathetic and it's predictable that they will often report on pieces of the case and then add in statistics of the player's, recent achievement in a match. Like Cristiano Ronaldo, however many times winner of the FIFA Player Award. Why is that relevant to him raping somebody? It's not actually. His performance on the pitch has nothing to do with it. And that's used to gloss over, either to be a word filler or to gloss over and taint a case and sort of frame it in the way that, they're just trying to destroy this wonderful person's career. No. I mean, I refuse to believe and reject the notion that people do this for attention. The amount of trauma that a survivor has to go through to revisit this kind of thing, no, I'm sorry. It doesn't work like that. I know the numbers. It doesn't add up.
We've mentioned some cases like the David De Gea and Neymar cases where, because they weren't proven, it's assumed that the woman was lying. And it feels like often cases are conflated. So if those two cases, the star was innocent and the woman allegedly lied, then that becomes kind of the base assumption in future cases.
Yeah, I think that's you're right. And it's a very simplistic take. But I think what's really important to also know is that how these cases are used to pile up and victim blame. For example, like you said, Balotelli's, the woman that's accusing Balotelli, someone will come out and say, well, look what happened with Neymar, or look what happened with De Gea. So, of course, I'll not mention Ronaldo. Like that, people go silent on that very quickly. Whereas the criminal charges against Ronaldo were dropped in Nevada, but against the Las Vegas Police Department. But that doesn't mean that it's not being tried civilly, like the woman's suing him. And I think that that's really important. That case is still ongoing. But this whole idea that it's very quick to write off that our superstar players couldn't have possibly done this, it's just about money-hungry bitches. And that's unacceptable completely. And that's something that we see being played over and over. And the way that people are so flippant about the way that they report on sexualized violence.
Why is it so important that the media covers this? Like it seems like there can be a lot of benefits as a result, or, negatives if it's not covered.
Yeah, I think that covering this type of story, particularly and specifically on sexualized violence, is very important, because what ends up happening is we often idolize sports heroes. And I think that leads to what's really dangerous is this idea that they can commit crimes with impunity. And that troubles me greatly, because we've seen now in so many sports, we've seen people and men with power specifically abused for decades, not just to mention the USA Gymnastics, horrific history of, victims that came forward and against former Dr. Larry Nasser.
For years, Larry Nasser was responsible for the care of most of the top gymnasts in the United States. In a Michigan courtroom, he pleaded guilty to charges of criminal sexual misconduct and admitted to using his position as team doctor to sexually abuse underage girls.
There's so much abuse. I think that saying, I don't want to, mess up my sports with stuff like this. People who say that are truly people of so much privilege. They don't want to inconvenience their entertainment with real life. And that's misleading, and it's unrealistic. So having conversations like this and including it and looking at why do we report on sports figures and athletes differently than we would other people. And Balotelli is no exception. I do think that his cases, as I mentioned before, it's important to be very nuanced because of the fact that he's a Black player who has suffered a lot of racism, and that, that's his point. He's a polarizing figure in Italy. And I think that has something to do with it, because I do get also uncomfortable with the way that he's written of by predominantly white media, and in the situation of sexualized violence, to pay attention to the histories and, the systemic oppression of Black men by the legal system. This is relevant to talk about. And these are things that do come into play. That being said, that still, while giving space for his victim, his alleged victim, to be able to speak and to have a place where she isn't. And that's the one thing I did notice about this story. Well, the little that I read in English was that the framing of the accuser of Balotelli was framed very differently than the way that Ronaldo was. And as somebody who looks at this and reads a lot about sexualized violence in football, it struck me immediately. Why was the angels were singing around Ronaldo and there was a halo, around him, whereas Ronaldo's accuser was really badly, treated, and as a result, she went silent, and she anticipated that, and she went under the radar. She went off the grid. And with Balotelli, there wasn't that. I'm not saying that I want to see victim blaming, but I just thought it was really interesting that when the accused is Black, it's framed differently. But I have to tell you, Josh, there was a time that I wanted to write about Cristiano Ronaldo a long time before Der Spiegel came up with the reports, and no editor wanted this piece. No editor wanted to publish it. I was going to co-write with my friend Dr. Brenda Elsey, co-host on my podcast, and she and I were dedicated to wanting to write about it, but nobody wanted it. And it's because it wasn't deemed important enough.
Wait, so you knew about this rape case of Ronaldo's and you were trying to write about it and, submitting pieces to editors, and they were knocking you back?
We submitted a piece, we submitted pitches, and yeah, I have the receipts for it. And it's staggering. We knew the murmurings, so it was very little written about it, but we still wanted to write about it. And essentially the story that we wanted to write was why? And that's what we ended up doing. Brenda and I did end up writing for Rewire, why did this happen in a way? And she also wrote for Vice, and then I wrote for Time Magazine after everything came out. But why nobody wanted to hear the story? That's part of the story. Why is this not getting published? And I talked about it at length. I was interviewed about it, that why nobody wanted it. And I had a few of those same editors email me back and say, "You still interested in writing?" And I'm like, nope. And, just because of my own ethics, I won't say who those editors were, but they know who they are. And this is the point of doing what I do, is because these kind of stories are really important, and having people understand why, and being able to look at somebody in a godlike manner is really unacceptable. And no two stories are the same, so they need to be treated as such, but they do need to be written about. And it is important, because when you say this isn't a sports story or it's not important, you're saying that person that's been abused doesn't matter, and that's not okay.
When you watch Ronaldo, what do you feel?
It's a really interesting question. I get very tense. There's a sense of disdain. I don't love watching him play because I get irritated. I am not one that's able to put aside these things and watch. And I mean, a lot of people could say, well, you can't really watch anything if you feel that way. No, but you can look at something critically. I'm not letting Cristiano Ronaldo take away my love for the game. He doesn't hold that much power over me. Definitely not, or the sport, and nobody is bigger than the game. But for me to watch, I try to use it as an assessment of, oh, wow, look at this person going forward and actually not having to deal with any. And I think back to Rio, actually. I believe it was Rio, and it was when David De Gea, the accusations came against David De Gea. Not only did he play, he was named captain. And Iker Casillas was not chosen to play for Spain, but David De Gea was. And this was immediately after following. And I always thought of that. And De La Bosque and why he chose De Gea. And he's like, well, we're just going to stand behind our player. I mean, the accusations against De Gea at the time were pretty intense.
He was implicated in a sex scandal investigation. One of the witnesses in that investigation has linked David De Gea, said the report, and two other footballers, one of them unknown and the other one Iker Munyen.
But how did media respond? How did his team respond? They responded by making him captain or having him play. And I think about that a lot. But the reality is that it did change the way that I looked at the game. Not my love for it, but the way that I looked at it and the lens by which I do look at things.
Well, I would encourage anyone to read the Der Spiegel report, but I just want to read one little stanza before I ask the next question. This is a quote from Ronaldo to his lawyer that, ended up coming out in the football leaks. She said no and stopped several times. I entered her from behind. It was rude. We didn't change position. 5 to 7 minutes. She said that she didn't want to, but she made herself available. But she kept saying, no, don't do it. I'm not like the others. I apologized afterwards. So why do you think that, people that and millions around the world are able to turn a blind eye to these very, very serious allegations for Ronaldo?
I think that what ends up happening is that people rely heavily, like I said, on the verdicts in the legal system. And what ends up happening is the legal system reflects how much money and power and access to resources you have. It doesn't actually truthfully reflect whether you're guilty or innocent. And so many times, accusers are let go on technicalities or by their legal team taking advantage of the vulnerability of accusers. And I've seen it many times unfold. And it basically comes down to money and power. And I think people tend to say, the charges against him were dropped. Well, the criminal charges against him were dropped. And a lot of people don't realize this either with Kobe Bryant. When he settled a civil suit with his accuser, it wasn't about money. It was very little, actually, money. She wanted him as part of the settlement to apologize publicly, and he did. And a lot of people don't remember that. They remember the words he says. He goes, although he said something, and I'm paraphrasing here, to the extent of, I remember the events differently, but I've come to understand her hurt and why she sees things the way she does. Those are very powerful words that he read out loud in public on record. And people are like, no, it doesn't mean that. And no, it does. And these statements by Ronaldo too, they're clear, they're damning, but people will essentially believe what they want to believe. And because I think it's also a product of being steeped in a patriarchal society and one that tolerates rape apologia, and toxic misogyny.
I want to finish on a case that I don't think many people know about, but as we speak, Robinho, famous Robinho from Brazil, with the little baby face, is playing in Turkey despite being convicted. I said convicted. That means proven guilty of gang rape when he was in Italy.
Brazilian football player Robinho has been sentenced to 9 years in prison for sexually assaulting an Albanian girl in a disco when he played for AC Milan. A court in the city found him guilty in absentia. 5 other men were also charged with assaulting the woman in 2013.
And as a result, he didn't even play a Europa League in Italy earlier this season against Roma because he would have been imprisoned had he stepped foot back in Italy. And yet he plays on. Mm-hmm. How can we look at FIFA seriously and say they care about women when they have a convicted rapist playing in one of their competitions?
Well, I mean, this is the thing that I don't understand. Like he's been convicted in Italy, but is still managing to play. And I think this goes to show how the system is broken. How people can not fall through the cracks, they can happily glide through them and circumvent the rules. So then when this is the catch-22, people say, well, look at this, the system, like the court system said they were innocent, but this is the same system that still allows people to play. And when you try to approach either FIFA or something like this, they'll say, well, we're not political. Like they'll back away, although we all know football is absolutely inherently political. But they'll not mention because they don't want to be bothered by it. And this is ultimately the thing. People in power don't want to be bothered by this kind of stuff. So they will just be like, it's not in our jurisdiction. And there'll be conversations about whose responsibility is, et cetera, who's to blame for a convicted rapist to be playing on their team. Why don't teammates speak out? Why is the club so easy to have them represent him? Like, what does that say for the club? We can't look to football to give us the roadmap for justice about these things. It has to be done by us all, because those in power in the systems in football are those that aren't committed to this type of action, and they're just committed to making money. Like the upper echelons of federations and associations are really about money. They're not about advocating. They're not guardians of the game. And I mean, for me, football is truly an example of a place where justice can thrive and integrity can live and being principled humans can exist, but it doesn't look like it it works out in that way all the time. So, we have to keep having these discussions. We have to keep looking at cases and saying we don't want to have this again and not repeat the same mistakes, which unfortunately, because of the system we're in, do get repeated time and time again.
Shireen Ahmed is an activist and writer, and you can listen to her regularly on the Burn It Down podcast. The show is produced by John McKenzie. I'm Josh Schneider-Weiler, and this was Football Today. And if you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on iTunes and share it with a friend. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.